One weekend can destroy a movie. But what happens when it destroys an entire studio? In the 1980s, Hollywood poured unimaginable money into science fiction, giant sets, experimental effects, and blockbuster dreams meant to rival Star Wars. Some of those gambles didn't just fail, they detonated. Careers ended, studios collapsed, millions vanished overnight. Tonight, we're uncovering 12 expensive 80s sci-fi flops so catastrophic they nearly bankrupted the companies that made them. And one of them almost erased a legendary studio forever. Flash Gordon, 1980. By the end of the 1970s, Hollywood executives believed they had discovered a formula: space equals profit. Star Wars had exploded across theaters in 1977, proving audiences were hungry for spectacular science fiction adventures. Studios rushed to find the next cosmic franchise. One of the most ambitious attempts was Flash Gordon, a colorful revival of the classic comic strip hero first created in the 1930s. Producer Dino De Laurentiis believed the property could become a massive global franchise. The production reflected that ambition. Lavish alien worlds were constructed on enormous sound stages. Costumes were deliberately extravagant, blending comic book surrealism with operatic spectacle. The soundtrack even featured music by the rock band Queen, giving the film a distinctive identity. But the gamble came with a steep price. The budget climbed to roughly $35 million, an enormous figure for the time. When the film arrived in theaters in 1980, audiences admired its visuals but struggled with its tone. The movie's campy style confused viewers expecting a more serious science fiction epic. Critics were divided and ticket sales quickly slowed. Domestic box office returns were disappointing. International performance helped somewhat, but not enough to justify the massive investment. For De Laurentiis, the financial impact was severe. The producer had already taken on significant financial risk while developing multiple large-scale productions. The underperformance of Flash Gordon weakened the stability of De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, contributing to financial pressures that would later threaten the entire company. Today, the film enjoys a devoted cult following, but in 1980, it was a reminder that replicating the success of Star Wars was far more difficult than Hollywood believed. Saturn III, 1980. The concept seemed straightforward. Combine the claustrophobic tension of Alien with the sleek, futuristic design of classic science fiction, place a major Hollywood star at the center, and audiences would follow. That was the plan behind Saturn III, a space station thriller starring Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett. Set on a remote research base orbiting Saturn, the story follows two scientists living in isolation while developing experimental hydroponic technology meant to feed Earth's growing population. Their quiet routine is shattered when a mysterious officer arrives with a prototype military robot named Hector. The machine is designed to assist human crews in dangerous environments. Instead, it becomes something far more dangerous. The robot begins to mimic human behavior, absorbing the darker impulses of the man controlling it. Soon, the station becomes a sealed environment where paranoia and violence escalate rapidly. Behind the scenes, however, the production itself was already in trouble. Multiple creative disagreements plagued the film. Director John Barry, known primarily as a production designer on Star Wars, struggled with the transition to directing, and key scenes were reportedly reshot or heavily modified during editing. The film's budget reached approximately $10 million, a significant investment for a relatively contained science fiction thriller. When Saturn III opened in 1980, audiences reacted coldly. Critics focused on its uneven tone and slow pacing. Word of mouth quickly weakened ticket sales. The film ultimately failed to recover its costs. While it did not single-handedly collapse a studio, Saturn III became one of several expensive genre disappointments that made investors increasingly cautious about mid-budget science fiction projects during the early 1980s. Space Hunter: Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, 1983. Timing can destroy a movie before audiences even sit down. In 1983, a new theatrical trend briefly swept Hollywood: 3D movies. These studios believed the technology might draw audiences back into theaters during a period of growing competition from home video. Producers rushed projects into production, hoping to capitalize on the novelty. One of those films was Space Hunter: Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, a post-apocalyptic science fiction adventure starring Peter Strauss and a young Molly Ringwald. The story follows a bounty hunter searching a hostile alien wasteland for three women whose spacecraft has crashed on a brutal desert planet. The landscape is filled with mutated creatures, scavengers, and a tyrannical warlord controlling the region. The production itself was ambitious. Elaborate desert sets were built and complex practical effects were designed specifically to exploit the 3D format. But the film's release date proved disastrous. See, Space Hunter premiered only days before Return of the Jedi, the highly anticipated final chapter of the original Star Wars trilogy. The result was predictable. Audience attention shifted almost entirely toward George Lucas's blockbuster. Even viewers curious about new science fiction films chose the safer option. Despite a budget estimated around $14 million, ticket sales struggled to keep pace with expectations. The film eventually earned modest revenue. But the marketing expenses and specialized 3D production costs reduced profitability dramatically. Instead of launching a franchise, Space Hunter became a cautionary tale about how the wrong release window can turn a major production into a financial disappointment almost overnight. Enemy Mine, 1985. Few productions illustrate Hollywood chaos better than Enemy Mine. The film began as an ambitious science fiction drama based on a respected short story by Barry B. Longyear. The premise was unusual for the genre. Instead of focusing on battles between humans and aliens, it explored what happens when two enemies are forced to depend on each other to survive. The story follows a human fighter pilot and a reptilian alien soldier stranded together on a hostile planet after their ships are destroyed in combat. Initially, the project was expected to become a major prestige science fiction release. Then, the production collapsed. Director Richard Loncraine began filming elaborate action sequences on expensive sets. But after several weeks of shooting, studio executives became concerned about the direction of the film. The footage reportedly failed to capture the emotional tone the studio expected. Production was shut down. The studio made the extraordinary decision to scrap large portions of the existing footage, hire a new director, Wolfgang Petersen, and begin the project again. Restarting the movie dramatically increased the budget, which climbed to nearly $29 million. By the time Enemy Mine reached theaters in 1985, expectations were already difficult to meet. The film earned praise from some critics for its thoughtful themes. However, audiences expecting a fast-paced science fiction spectacle were surprised by the slower, character-focused story. Box office returns were disappointing. The expensive restart meant the movie had to perform extremely well to recover its costs. And it didn't. Today, Enemy Mine is often remembered as an underrated science fiction film. But during its original release, it represented one of the decade's most expensive production miscalculations. Krull, 1983. In the early 1980s, studios were desperate to find the next fantasy science fiction franchise. The enormous success of Star Wars had proven that audiences would embrace epic adventures filled with alien worlds, heroic quests, and spectacular visual effects. Executives across Hollywood began searching for stories that might replicate that success. One of the most ambitious attempts was Krull. Produced by Columbia Pictures, the film blended science fiction and medieval fantasy into a single epic narrative. The story follows Prince Colwyn, a warrior determined to rescue his bride after she is captured by an alien warlord known as the Beast. The Beast arrives on Earth inside a massive mountain-like spacecraft, bringing an army of armored soldiers called Slayers. To defeat them, Colwyn assembles an unlikely group of allies, bandits, magicians, and warriors, while wielding a strange weapon known as the Glaive, a spinning five-bladed throwing star with mysterious powers. The scale of the production was enormous. Huge fortress sets were built inside British studios. Complex practical effects were created for alien creatures and battle scenes. The budget eventually climbed to approximately $30 million, making it one of the most expensive films Columbia had produced at the time. Expectations were enormous. Unfortunately, the results did not match them. When Krull premiered in 1983, critics were uncertain how to interpret its unusual mix of fantasy and science fiction. Audiences, meanwhile, were already experiencing fatigue from the growing number of Star Wars imitators flooding theaters. Box office revenue reached only about $16 million domestically. For Columbia Pictures, the financial loss was significant. Instead of launching a franchise, Krull became a reminder that spectacle alone could not guarantee success in the increasingly crowded science fiction market of the 1980s. Solar Babies, 1986. Some films fail quietly. Others collapse so spectacularly that they become cautionary stories whispered around Hollywood for decades. Solar Babies belongs firmly in the second category. The project began with a deceptively simple idea. Combine the youth rebellion energy of Mad Max with the futuristic style of 80s science fiction. The story takes place on a desert Earth, where water has become the planet's most valuable resource. A powerful corporation controls the remaining supply, forcing young people into labor camps. A small group of rebellious teenagers escape into the wasteland. Their transportation of choice? Roller skates. Yes, roller skating rebels racing across a dystopian desert while carrying a mysterious glowing sphere with supernatural powers. The film's unusual concept might have remained a modest curiosity if the production had stayed small. Instead, the movie spiraled into a massive logistical disaster. Filming took place in extreme desert conditions in Namibia, where equipment frequently malfunctioned in the intense heat. Sets had to be rebuilt multiple times. Vehicles broke down in the sand, shooting schedules collapsed, costs rose rapidly. Originally intended as a relatively modest science fiction adventure, the budget ballooned to roughly $23 million, a staggering amount for a film starring mostly unknown actors. When Solar Babies finally reached theaters in 1986, the result was catastrophic. Audiences were baffled by the roller skating premise. Critics mocked the film's tone, and ticket sales barely registered. The movie earned less than $2 million in North America. For MGM/UA, already struggling financially during the decade, Solar Babies became one of the most embarrassing and expensive failures of the mid-1980s. Today, it survives as a strange cult curiosity. But at the time, it was proof that ambition without direction can destroy a production long before audiences ever arrive. Lifeforce, 1985. The pitch sounded irresistible. Combine space exploration, alien invasion, and apocalyptic horror, then place the entire spectacle in the middle of London. That was the concept behind Lifeforce, a science fiction epic directed by Tobe Hooper, the filmmaker, who had terrified audiences with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Cannon Films hoped the movie would elevate the studio from low-budget exploitation to big-budget blockbuster territory. The story begins with a space shuttle crew discovering a mysterious alien spacecraft hidden inside the tail of Halley's Comet. Inside the vessel, they find 3 humanoid beings preserved in crystalline chambers. The astronauts bring them back to Earth. It is a catastrophic mistake. The creatures awaken and begin draining the life energy from anyone who comes near them. As the infection spreads, London descends into chaos, turning into a surreal nightmare of collapsing infrastructure and mass hysteria. The scale of the production reflected Cannon's enormous ambition. Massive sets were built to recreate parts of London in ruin. Special effects teams designed elaborate visual sequences showing victims literally disintegrating as their life energy was drained. The budget climbed to roughly $25 million, making it one of Cannon Films' most expensive productions ever. But when Lifeforce premiered in 1985, the response was bewilderment. The film's strange mix of science fiction, horror, and surreal imagery confused audiences. Marketing struggled to explain what the movie actually was. Ticket sales quickly collapsed. For Cannon Films, already juggling several risky productions, the failure of Lifeforce contributed to the growing financial instability that would eventually push the company toward bankruptcy by the end of the decade. Dune, 1984. Some films fail because of poor ideas. Others fail because the ideas are simply too big for their time. Frank Herbert's novel Dune had long been considered nearly impossible to adapt for the screen. The book contained dense political intrigue, multiple alien cultures, and an enormous mythology stretching across thousands of years. But producer Dino De Laurentiis believed it could become the next great science fiction franchise. To bring the story to life, he hired visionary filmmaker David Lynch, whose surreal style had earned critical attention in earlier films. The production that followed was enormous. Gigantic desert landscapes were recreated on sound stages. Hundreds of elaborate costumes were designed for the rival noble houses fighting for control of the planet Arrakis. Massive mechanical creatures, including the legendary sandworms, required complex practical effects. The scale pushed the budget to approximately $40 million, an enormous figure for the mid-1980s. Expectations were enormous as well. But when Dune premiered in 1984, audiences struggled to follow the complicated story compressed into a single film. So critics were divided, praising the visuals, but questioning the narrative clarity. The box office returns were disappointing. Although the film eventually developed a passionate cult following, its initial performance failed to recover its massive production costs. For De Laurentiis, the financial setback was severe. The disappointing returns weakened his production company's finances and forced the cancellation of planned sequels. Instead of launching a new science fiction empire, thus Dune became one of the most famous examples of Hollywood ambition colliding with the limits of mainstream audiences. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai, Across the Eighth Dimension, 1984. Sometimes a film fails not because it lacks ambition, but because audiences simply don't know what they're watching. That was the strange fate of The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai, Across the Eighth Dimension, one of the most unusual science fiction films of the 1980s. The premise alone sounded almost impossible to summarize. Buckaroo Banzai is a brilliant neurosurgeon, physicist, test pilot, and rock musician, all at the same time. During a high-speed experiment with a jet-powered vehicle, he discovers a way to pass through solid matter and accidentally opens a gateway into another dimension. That dimension is inhabited by hostile aliens preparing to invade Earth. To stop them, Buckaroo assembles a team of scientists and musicians known as the Hong Kong Cavaliers, a group that operates somewhere between a rock band and a secret defense force. The film's tone blended science fiction, comedy, action, and surreal humor. Director W.D. Richter created a story that treated its bizarre universe as if it were already part of a long-running franchise. Characters reference past adventures the audience has never seen. Inside jokes appear without explanation. Entire plot threads feel like they belong to earlier chapters of an imaginary series. The production cost approximately $17 million, a substantial investment for a film with such an unconventional tone. When it premiered in 1984, audiences were confused. Marketing struggled to explain the movie's identity. Was it a comedy? A serious science fiction film? A parody? Ticket sales collapsed quickly. The planned sequel, Buckaroo Banzai Against the World Crime League, that was quietly canceled. Today, the film is celebrated as a cult classic. But in the 1980s, it was proof that Hollywood sometimes creates stories far stranger than audiences are ready to accept. Howard the Duck, 1986. In the mid-1980s, George Lucas was one of the most powerful names in Hollywood. The creator of Star Wars had redefined blockbuster filmmaking, and studios were eager to support any project connected to his name. In one of those projects was Howard the Duck, a film adaptation of the Marvel comic about a wise-cracking humanoid duck accidentally transported from his own dimension to Earth. On paper, the idea seemed promising. Lucasfilm invested heavily in complex animatronic technology to bring the character to life. Multiple performers worked together inside elaborate suits designed to create realistic movement and facial expressions. Advanced puppetry systems were used to animate Howard's eyes and beak. And the technical work alone made the production extremely expensive. The final budget reached roughly $37 million, a massive investment for a comedy-driven science fiction film. When Howard the Duck opened in theaters in 1986, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Critics were baffled by the film's strange tone, which mixed slapstick comedy with darker science fiction elements. Audiences struggled to connect with a story centered on an alien duck navigating human society. Word of mouth turned negative almost instantly. The movie earned barely half of its production budget at the box office. For Universal Pictures, the loss was embarrassing. For Lucasfilm, the film became a rare misstep in a decade otherwise defined by blockbuster success. For years afterward, Howard the Duck was frequently cited as one of the most notorious box office disasters in Hollywood history. The Black Hole, 1979. By the late 1970s, Disney was facing an identity crisis. The studio had built its reputation on family-friendly animation and live-action adventures, but the explosive success of Star Wars convinced executives that science fiction represented the future of blockbuster filmmaking. Their response was The Black Hole. are a dark and ambitious space epic intended to compete directly with the new generation of sci-fi blockbusters. The production was enormous. Disney constructed one of the most elaborate spaceship sets ever built at the time. Advanced visual effects were developed using experimental computer-controlled cameras. The film also pushed the studio into darker storytelling territory than it had ever attempted before. At approximately $20 million, the budget made it one of Disney's most expensive productions up to that point. Expectations were enormous, but when the film arrived in theaters, audiences were uncertain how to respond. The movie's tone shifted between family adventure and surprisingly bleak philosophical themes about life, death, and the unknown depths of space. Marketing struggled to define its target audience. While the film earned respectable revenue during its initial release, the enormous production and promotional costs meant it failed to deliver the profit Disney needed. The studio spent years recovering financially from the investment. Ironically, the black hole would later become a cult favorite among science fiction fans. But during the early 1980s, it represented a risky moment when Disney nearly lost millions chasing the space opera craze. Heaven's Gate, 1980. It began as one of the most anticipated films in Hollywood. Director Michael Cimino had just won the Academy Award for The Deer Hunter, a film celebrated for its sweeping scope and emotional power. When he proposed a massive historical epic titled Heaven's Gate, studios were eager to give him creative freedom. That freedom would become legendary. The production grew rapidly beyond its original plan. Cimino demanded enormous, meticulously detailed sets, recreating entire frontier towns. Streets were rebuilt repeatedly to achieve precise visual symmetry. These scenes were filmed dozens of times while the director adjusted tiny details of lighting or camera movement. Schedules slipped, costs exploded. The original budget of roughly $11 million eventually ballooned to more than $40 million, an astonishing figure for 1980. The financial risk fell heavily on United Artists, the studio financing the film. When Heaven's Gate finally premiered, the reaction was catastrophic. Early screenings were met with harsh criticism. Heard and the studio rushed to cut nearly an hour from the film before wider release. But the damage had already been done. Audiences stayed away. The movie earned only a fraction of its massive budget. For United Artists, the consequences were devastating. The financial disaster weakened the studio so severely that its parent company soon sold the entire operation. Today, Heaven's Gate is often studied as one of the most infamous production failures in film history. A single film, one director's vision, and a reminder that in Hollywood, even success can lead to catastrophe when ambition grows too large to control. Science fiction promised Hollywood the future. Instead, these films delivered some of the most expensive disasters in movie history. Studios chased the next Star Wars and ended up losing fortunes, careers, and sometimes entire companies. Yet time can be strange. Many of these failures are now cult classics. Which one do you think deserved better, and which flop shocked you the most?